Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Doxtater. I am the artist that created the dioramas that you see. If you have a chance to come in, and there's small information cards beside each of the small dioramas around the room, so I would invite you to do that at some point. What I'm going to do today is talk about my understanding, my studying of this, this very sacred story. I'm going to start by apologizing to you because we have a lot of people in our community who have been very hard workers at keeping our languages, and they've studied our languages and they're bringing them back to our community. So I feel as though when I speak in English, because I don't have my language, when I speak in English, that this is quite a symbol of the violence that was committed against our people, taking our languages away. So I want to acknowledge that. When I first started to study the Great Law, one of the blocks that I had was the fact that I don't have the language, and I had to go through a process of some healing and some forgiveness to be able to study it and understand it and try to express it in a way that I understood it and that other people that are limited by language or loss of language would be able to understand it too. So there was two parts to that. One was in about 1975, there was a show on TV, and it was called That's Incredible. And on this TV show, they talked about these different scientific discoveries. And so this was, I was in high school at the time. There was one episode where they talked about how the venom from a snake bite can be taken and it can be used as the medicine to cure that same species snake bite. So I always remembered that metaphor, that understanding, and when I started to study the Great Law, I used that as part of my my baseline for giving myself permission, because I thought with a history of intergenerational trauma inflicted on our family through the residential schools, that I had to forgive myself, I guess, for not having the language at that point. So in order to help myself and help anybody that might be searching the way I was. So that when I speak about it in English, I would just ask you to keep that in mind. Then the other part of it was I was at a class with a man by the name of Gennady Kalanin. He's a Russian-born Canadian artist, and he had a slideshow. And one of the slides that he showed was the Last Supper. And when he was talking about it, I started thinking about how probably everyone in the world on some level would see that painting and understand what it represents. And I started to think, well, what would we have had? What would ours have looked like? Because so many things from our culture and our beliefs had been destroyed, that I knew we didn't have oil paintings or acrylic paintings, and we had what we had. So it was kind of like a process of connecting the dots in my head and coming up with this. So I thought, as I study the Great Law, as I try to write about it in English, I also want something that transcends language, that we can all understand by looking at it. And so my understanding, and even in my family, we always made corn husk dolls. So I thought, well, that's what I'll do. I'll do it in corn husk dolls. So when I try to understand it and see what it would look like, so that's where this came from. That's where the journey of the peacemaker came from, and that's where the ratification of the Great Law came from too. This kind of has attached a couple names to it. One is it encircles everything, and also the first council fire, because that's what it represents. So now I'm going to get a little personal, because the reason I started studying the Great Law, actually it's 9 years ago tomorrow morning. I was involved in a really serious car accident in my community. And when I was actually admitted to MAC, and I was in MAC for 3 weeks, I had 2 broken legs, a broken arm. I got hit by something, but the swelling in my face has never gone down. So tomorrow morning it'll be 9 years. As I was healing from that, I wanted to know how to heal from that, how to to find that peace. Growing up in our community, there's a number of issues that come up, and we often have community meetings. And often at these community meetings, someone would stand up and say, well, everything you need is in the Great Law. And then they'd go on to have some big kind of convoluted explanation that I never really quite followed, and I didn't really know how they knew that. And so, but it was just something that I took for granted that I would hear and not understand and not really think about. So I thought I really wanted to understand. I really wanted to know if that's something that is possible, then how do I find that as an individual, as a person who is probably pretty vulnerable to be stuck in a place of anger or hurt or just unrest, not a restful mind. How do I find that peace? So that's when I started to study it. During that time, I found that there were a lot of different versions of it. There was like little chunks of it here and there. There's even little sayings that people pick up in like just mainstream, like, oh, you should bury the hatchet. Well, that actually comes from the Great Law. But I wanted to try to put it all together. So I did. So when I started to study the Great Law, what I came up with was, or what I understood, was that there were 3 guiding principles, and that those 3 guiding principles were what they talk about: peace, power, and righteousness. And so again, it's something that you hear, it's kind of becomes very like what they call rote learning. You memorize it, but you don't really put any thought into it. So I took out a dictionary and I started to try to define these things and what they meant, and try to cross-reference them with the other resources that I had. So my understanding was that peace means to have a healthy mind, and that it means to have a healthy body, or to strive for those things. That power, and again, I'm limited by language, but it means unity, non-judgmental unity, and that righteousness was about justice, and it was about compassion, and then folded in there somewhere was also about forgiveness. So I took those three principles, and what I found was that the healing that I was about to try to find had to do more with just that car accident. It had to do with things that were more historic. I mean, that was part of it, but there was also other things, even like whether it was personal or family or extended family or community-based or historic. It was all these things, because the first struggle again was because of the language that I didn't have. So I'll probably mention that quite a bit, and you might get tired of hearing that, but that's something that I think is really important to emphasize, that when you're talking to one of our people, we call ourselves Ongwehoe. And when I asked for the translation of the word Ongwehoe, they said that Ongwehoe means real people. So again, I looked up the word real, and the word real means verifiable, true, undisputed. So when you're talking to one of our people, we're real people. So we have this, I guess you would call worldview, this understanding that there's Canadians and there's real people. Now, when I was trying to understand how this piece works, because this was my big thing, was I didn't understand how it worked. In this history of our people, they talk about how this was like about 1,000 years ago. There were a lot of wars going on, and there was so much wars and so much killing that some people have described that the blood ran like rivers. There was just all of this slaughter happening. And that the other part of that was this cannibalism. Again, because there's so many scattered pieces of the story, and it's kind of like a big jigsaw puzzle, that my understanding is that there was a belief that you would consume part of that person's spirit, and that it would strengthen you somehow. And so that's why this was something that was valued. And that when Peacemaker came and he had those words of peace, power, and righteousness, and that he took those, him and Ionwata took them to the different villages, and shared that with the people, that they had to try to get people to accept that those things shouldn't be valued, that we should value a healthy mind and a healthy body, that we should understand unity, that we should all understand that if one person succeeds, we all succeed, that if I see gifts in you, that it shouldn't make me feel bad about myself, I should celebrate that, and that there should be some reciprocity there within our relationship. So this was unbelievable at that time, and they said that people, in my research again, that it wasn't accepted because it was laughed at. It was everything that you valued at that time that was frowned on. That if you came to you now and said, you know, these are the things that you value, they're useless. We have to change and we have to do it this way. So that was a big part of having this unity, having this ratified by these 5 different nations that were actually warring. As part of my process, what I did was I decided that, well, I'll go back to the story a little bit. There was a man by the name of Ayonwata, and they said that Ayonwata had lost all of his family members and that he had wandered alone in grief and there's not really any time frame on there of how long he was in grief. But during that time he was in grief. He was very sad. He had no one to talk to. He was trying to cope with the losses that he had experienced. And so at one point he had come across these, some people say sumac and some people say elderberry bushes, and he cut the twigs and strung them together, and he put words to them. And the words were about lifting grief, about clearing the tears from your eyes, about clearing the dust from your ears and clearing your throat. All these things that we do every day where we see things and appreciate things. We see the people that we love. We hear and listen to the people who we love. We hear the birds that lift our spirits. We hear the laughter of children. We speak to people. We also eat and taste things. So these are all things that are really important. So those were significant in what he saw as a way of lifting grief. So I thought that was pretty significant, and that time of silence. So what I did was I decided that I would do that. I was feeling very isolated. Our lives had changed quite a bit because I was immobile for months. I had really good care, and I had really supportive people coming in and helping me and everything. But it was a difficult time. But I didn't want to get stuck there. I didn't want to be the person who got into a bad car accident and, you know, she used to work in the community or whatever. And so I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to stay there. And I wanted to know how they were able to take those teachings and make it into something that we still lean on today. And that because in the last probably I think the last residential schools closed in the 90s. So we come from that history where that was a common thing that happened in our communities. And but it was no longer against the law to talk about these things. Our kids aren't going to be taken away. We can talk about them. We're not going to be, I think in the Indian Act it said something like if there were 5 Native people gathered together that the RCMP could come in and arrest everyone. So that's not going to happen. I mean, I hope it's not going to happen. So that's kind of where I'll start. I'm trying to keep my eye on the clock too. Okay, so what I did was I took that day, I had my son light a fire and I sat beside that fire. And so what I understood at this point was that we can talk about peace. You know, we should have world peace. We should have international peace. We should have national peace. We should have a good community, and we should have a good family. And it all starts with one person. We have to, as individuals, well, you know what? We don't have to. I feel I had to really understand what peace was for myself. So I took that one day, sitting beside a fire. I had a very modest lunch. I had water and some fruit and some crackers. And I had a journal. I had a painting that I wanted to work on. So I took that day, and as long as I was quiet, I just wanted to be quiet and think about things. And but I made myself a rule book. So I had 3 rules. And the first rule was that based on peace, that during that day, that if a thought came into my mind that did not enhance my state of mind regarding my health or anyone else's, that I would dismiss it from my mind. If a thought entered my mind that didn't evoke unity, then I would dismiss it from my mind. And if a thought came into my mind that wasn't fair to others and was judgmental or was without forgiveness, and forgiveness didn't mean just forgiving, white people or anything like that. It also meant me forgiving myself for unfortunate choices that I had made throughout my life. So that was my criteria for the day. And I sat and I was able to experience a real humility, because I was there by the woods by my house, and as far as I knew, no one knew where I was, and no one really cared where I was. And so that was kind of a little bit humbling. But then the other thing that happened was, going back to that teaching of, in our creation story, they talk about how when the Sky Woman came to the earth, and she had given birth to her daughter, and then when her daughter grew and she had given birth to the twins, and then when the twins were born, their mother died and they buried her in the earth. At a time after that, the twins started to make our bodies from elements from the earth, but it was only the good-minded twin that could breathe that breath of life into the human beings. And so in that time, I became to understand something, that our breath comes from Sungwayat Diso. And because our breath comes from Sungwayat Diso, it's sacred. And because our bodies, and not just real people, Canadians, everyone from the planet, our bodies come from the earth according to our teachings, that our bodies are sacred. That we have to take every breath, and every breath that we take is a gift from Sungwayat Diso. And so when we make mistakes or when we make unfortunate decisions that don't respect ourselves, that we have to allow ourselves some forgiveness, but we also have to allow ourselves some time to make that understanding and to make those connections. Because as you know in our community, or as you might know in our communities, there's a lot of talk about a lot of the trauma that occurs. And when you come from a community that has been taught for hundreds of years through legislation and laws that says that you're less than human, that you're human in form only, and that all those laws that are put in place are to do exactly what they did, and that is to take us away from our Mother Earth, that it becomes a little bit overwhelming. And so there's so much forgiveness that that was part of my looking for that peace. What I discovered during that one day was just how easy it is for me to tangle my own mind. I found out how easy it is for me to weigh myself down with guilt, anger, sadness, and shame, even if it was personal, even if it was vicarious, or even at a community or a historic level. I became aware of how I attempt to manipulate situations based on my survival tactics. And that has to do with my breath. Because I was there all by myself and I had no audience, I became aware of short breaths, facial expressions, raised eyebrows. And I became embarrassed about that, because our breath comes with a responsibility, and that I became really embarrassed about how the long drawn out breaths I've used to emanate anger, impatience, guilt, and disgust. And we probably, I hope we all did it, I hope it's not just me. But that's a sacred thing that we're doing. We're using that sacredness for something that isn't peaceful. So we're supposed to be about peace in a really consistent way. I used this prayer and said that peace meant a healthy body and a healthy mind, that power meant harmonious, nonviolent unity, and righteousness meant justice between people and justice between nations, and compassion and forgiveness. So if we do that on an individual level, if we do that in our homes and we treat our families like that, and our families treat our extended families like that, and then it goes out, and if we can all carry that peace. The other thing that I thought is important to mention and of course I didn't highlight it, so I'm not sure where it is. But there was two things. In the language, the way I understand it is that the greeting is, do you carry the peace? And so I looked up those words, and I found out that carrying is a verb, so it's an action that we do. So when you carry something, it's actually something that's a conscious effort that you're carrying something. You're taking it with you, you're transporting it. And that peace is a noun, so it's an actual thing. It's an actual thing that you carry. And so it wasn't something that I could take for granted anymore, of just saying, yeah, I grew up in Six Nations, yeah, everything you know is in the Great Law, everything you need is in the Great Law. That there had to be a conscious effort to understand what that peace is and how we show that, how we emanate that, and that we have permission to do that. And then part of that is that forgiveness too, because for so long that was against the law for our people to even talk about these things. So I have a little short story, have 4 minutes. I'm trying to stay right to the second here. And so I'll go over this just a little bit, very briefly. What you see in front of you is, you see the 5 nations. There's 50 chiefs and Peacemaker and Jigonsassin. Peacemaker is the one that was born on the north shore of Lake Ontario, and he's the one that went across the lake in the stone canoe and met up with Ionuata, who is over here somewhere. So these nations were brought together. The tree that's in the middle is a white pine, and that white pine was uprooted, and the weapons of war were thrown in there, and then it was replanted. Those roots go out to the 4 directions, and the teaching behind that is that any person is supposed to be able to follow one of those roots to find that protection of that peace. There was an eagle that was placed on top, and they say that the white pine grows the highest and the eagle flies the highest and sees the furthest, so that eagle is a symbol of protection. The eagle is supposed to warn us if anything is coming to harm our people. The way I did this was just what they call artistic license. I think that's one of your phrases. Is I put the women on the outside because in a very normal and natural and logical way that women help shape our nations. And so because we've been through so much trauma in our community, that this is my way of expressing that it's up to the women to bring our people back into our community, to embrace each other, and to share that peace, to celebrate that unity, that peace, that compassion, that love, that good-mindedness, that healthiness, all of those things. So this was an important thing. Now, so the little story that I'll share with you about that is that I have a little shop in Ashwegan, and that's not a commercial, that's just a fact. And there was a young man that came into the shop probably in the fall sometime, and I didn't know him. I don't even know if he was from the community or not. And we talked about a little bit of things, and he talked about how he was learning, really trying to make an effort to understand the culture and participate in ceremonies. And so we chatted for a little while, and kind of like, yeah, that's really good, I'm glad you're doing that, and so we chatted, and so then he left. It was nice talking to you, and so he left. And so after he left, I sat back down and I was working on whatever I was doing, and a couple minutes later the door come flying open again, and it was him. And I was like, okay, what's up? He goes, I have a question for you. Now this was set up in the shop at the time, but it was kind of all squished together over in the corner. And he went walking over to the piece, and he pointed at the tree. He said, I've traveled around to a lot of the territories, and every time I've asked this question, I've got a different answer. And he was kind of a tall guy, and he said, where is that? And I was like, oh, what do you mean? He goes, where is that tree planted? He said, some people have told me it's in Onondaga, some people have told me it's in Tyendinaga. Where do you think it is? And so I thought about it for a little while. And I said, well, my understanding is this. And again, this is like my own research, my own understanding of this. I said, we're supposed to carry that peace, and those 4 roots are supposed to go out to the 4 directions, and anyone's supposed to be able to follow them back and find that protection. So if you're carrying a part of that peace, where do you think it is? And he stood there for a couple of seconds, and he kind of took a step back, and he said, "It's right here." So that's it, folks.